Today is a really great day for me because I've wanted to do this for literally years. I've been explaining to people how PID controllers work using words and concepts for a long time, but I've never had a physical, virtual object that would actually demonstrate the concepts. And doing it with a real quadcopter, it's too much. It's too much to do it with a real quadcopter. We need something like this where we can break it down one step at a time from first principles, introduce things in a gradual way so that at the end you really know what they're there for. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, I do need to acknowledge that I vibe coded this 100% with Claude AI. And so if you are an actual programmer and you look at the code and you're like, this code is garbage, yup. I'm not a programmer. Actually, technically I am. I have a degree in computer science, but I have never done professional coding and I'm super out of date. So yes, this is garbage. And also, I do need to acknowledge, you can just go and you can take the code. It's just sitting there on my website. You could take this, you could do whatever you want with it. You could paste it into Claude and you could modify it to make it different in some way. That is completely up to you. I'm just putting this out there for the whole world to use. I'm not putting it behind a paywall or anything like that. That's just not my style. But I do want to head off some of the comments of people going down there and saying this code is garbage and or Bardwell, you people are stealing your code. It's fine. With that said, let's get into the video. Let's start with an overview of the interface so you can understand what's going on as I'm interacting with the app. And the first and most basic thing that we have is this orange handle, I like to call it, and this blue line, which I call the follower. And the goal of the PID controller is going to be to make that follower follow the handle. So if I move the handle like this, the PID controller will try to make the follower go to wherever the handle is. We can see that the orange handle is labeled set point in the app, and that is actually consistent with how a real PID controller works. A real PID controller will always try to make some real-world phenomena follow a set point. So a very simple example would be that you have a thermostat on the wall, you set a temperature on the thermostat, you want the room to be a certain temperature, and then the PID controller would adjust the air conditioner or the heating unit to try to make the real temperature in the room track that set point. So anytime we have a PID controller, we have a set point, and then we have another measured value that we're trying to make follow the set point. In the case of this app, we'll call it the set point and the follower. So the goal of the PID controller is to make the follower follow the set point. And in order to do that, it has 4 tools at its disposal: PID and feed forward. And in order to understand how those tools work, we're going to start by setting them to 0. So the PID controller has no PID gains whatsoever. And when I do that, as I move the follower, nothing will happen. Okay, well, we have to start from somewhere. We're going to start from nothing. Now I want you to take a look down at the scope, because the ability to read this scope is actually pretty important to understanding what a PID controller is doing, especially in the real world. As you go into the real world and you start looking at black box looks an awful lot like this scope. We can just click the maximize button here and maximize it. And so this scope is a nice baby way of starting to learn to read black box logs. What we can see here is, hold on, let me move this back. I don't understand. Oh, I found a bug, but I'm not sure why. Okay, well, there's still some bugs. I'm gonna go ahead and reset these back to 0, and we'll move the follower, and then I will maximize the window, and let's just start looking at what's going on here. Let me just zoom in here. And what we see is that the orange line represents the set point, that's the handle position, and the blue line represents the follower, and the red line represents error. Error is going to be the difference between the set point and the follower. So we can see that as the set point moves to its new position, the orange line, the follower doesn't move at all, and error grows. And something's wrong with our y-axis scaling here, because if error is the difference between the set point and the follower, then the red line should just be tracking the orange line here. Oh well, don't worry about that. Suffice it to say that the error grows and nothing happens. The goal of the PID controller is going to be to reduce the error to 0. So what the PID controller wants to see is that the blue line, the follower, is exactly laid on top of the orange line, the set point. In a perfect world, they would track each other perfectly. And the red line, error, is always 0. So that's the first principle you want to grasp. The PID controller's goal is to keep the error at 0. The red line would stay here in the center and just be a flat line, and have the follower, the blue line, track the set point, the orange line, perfectly. Well, how can we make that happen? We're going to start with P gain. And P stands for proportional. And proportional means that the further the follower is from the set point, the harder the PID controller will push the follower towards the set point. One of the things I like to do when I think about a PID controller is I think about the PID controller pushing or pulling on the follower in one direction or another direction. We've made this very simple because we just have a single axis. So we can either push to the left or push to the right. That's it. We've made it very simple. So let's leave P set to 0, and we're going to move the follower. We're going to see that that error goes up. And then if I add just a little bit of P gain, the follower will move towards the set point. Now the way it works is that the further the follower is from the set point, the harder the P term pushes. So if I take this back down to 0 and I move the follower far away from the set point, what we should see is that it accelerates harder. We'll just raise that just a little bit. Our P gain was a little higher there, so that's also going to make it accelerate harder. But the further it is, the harder it's going to accelerate and the faster it's going to accelerate to get back to that set point. Now, we can immediately see that this isn't working like we might like it to work. We can see that the follower is just oscillating back, forth, around the set point. And the reason for that is that as it gets closer to the set point, the push decreases. So at the moment, let me just try to hit the pause button here, and right there. At the moment where the follower is right on top of the set point, we can see that the P term here, that's this dark blue line, at that moment, the P term is at 0. But the follower has some velocity already, and so even though we've stopped pushing on it, it overshoots, and we get into oscillation. If I reset this again, let's take a more realistic P term value. Take it to about there. And we can see that with a more realistic P gain, that oscillation is not as extreme. It's still happening though. And that oscillation will eventually settle down. What makes it settle down is not the P term itself, but the physical constraints of the model. So we have here the mass and the drag sliders, and the mass slider gives the follower some inertia, and the drag slider acts like friction to kind of slow it down. So if you were in a frictionless world, then you would push the follower one time and it would just keep going forever, and the P term would just keep bouncing it back and forth. In this model, the drag function makes it slow down. In fact, if I bring that drag all the way up, we can see that it very quickly damps down and stops oscillating. But we've got that drag value set to a relatively low value because we want to amplify the effect of the PID controller and really see what it's doing. Let's take a minute here and look at the step response graph, because the step response graph is a key way of understanding how the PID controller is working. We can look at that follower bouncing back and forth as we move, but it doesn't really give us a generalized picture of the behavior of the algorithm. And the step response graph is going to show over time how the follower will relate to the set point. So we can see here that initially the follower will be behind the set point. We'll move the set point and the follower will, there's error. Okay. The P term will begin to push the follower towards the set point. At this point in time, the follower will be right on top of the set point, but it will overshoot. And the P term will start pulling back the other direction. And we'll see that basically we're going to get a constant oscillation. Whereas if we take that drag value and bring it up, you can see that that oscillation will very quickly be damped down by the drag. And so that's like how we read the step response graph. And I want you to understand that this step response graph that we're looking at here, if you get into PID tuning with PIDToolbox, that tool made by Brian White, that tool is also going to show you a step response graph. But the difference between this step response graph and the one in PIDToolbox is this step response graph is just mathematically derived from the PID gains. This is a complete simulation, so we just know what the step response is going to be because we're simulating every aspect of this. In the real world, what you do is you fly your drone, you do some moves, and then the PIDToolbox program evaluates your real-world step response using gyros, and that you can use that then to see what you need to do with your PID terms. I think this tool is super useful because you can train yourself to look at step response and go, okay, if my step response looks like this, then I need to make this change to get it to look better. And or like, what does a good step response look like? I really feel like that is a great way to use this step response tool. So what don't we like about this step response? What we don't like is that the oscillation is going basically forever. And in fact, if we raise the P gain up too much, we get to this situation where, do you see that the oscillation is not just going forever, but it's actually getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we get this unstable warning. We've got a feedback loop, just like when audio signal, a microphone picks up feedback and it gets louder and louder and louder. That's what's happening here. And just for fun, let's watch that happen. So here we go. And it's slowly getting worse and worse and worse, and eventually it flies away. In the real world, this is like when you hit the throttle and your quad goes, right? In the real world, it's seldom like just literally flies away, although some of us have experienced that something goes wrong with the drone and it just flies to the moon and you have to disarm and crash. In the real world, it usually will and settle back down again, but you will get these little punches of feedback, and that is a sign that your P gain is too high. When your quadcopter does that, that's what that means. But why does that feedback happen? Because if the P term is always pushing the follower towards the set point, how can it ever push the follower away from the set point and amplify the size of the oscillation? The reason for that is this delay slider. In the real world, there is always a delay between the flight controller looking at the gyro and seeing what the quadcopter is currently doing and then going, oh, I need to push it this way. And then it sends a signal to the motors, and the motors change speed. There's always a delay between the PID controller saying, here's what I need to do, and then that actually happening. And because there's that delay, we can get a situation where the PID controller means to be pushing the follower toward the set point and reducing the oscillation, and instead it's actually pushing it away. So again, if I reset here and take this delay down to 0, with the delay at 0, there can never be an unstable oscillation. And in fact, if you look at the step response, you see that the step response is always getting slower. If I raise the drag, that amplifies that even more. With no delay, the oscillation will always become smaller until eventually friction or drag takes it to 0. But as I add delay, we'll start to get a situation where sometimes the PID controller is pushing the follower the wrong direction because of that delay, and therefore we can get this amplification. This is a great example of why it is so important in a real-world PID controller to reduce the delay between the flight controller and the motors, basically. Every little bit of delay we add makes it just that much easier to enter this unstable feedback state, and every little bit of delay we reduce makes the PID controller able to be that much more effective. I had a great time making this tool. This is something I have wanted for a long time, and it's only through the power of AI, it hurts me to say that I actually was able to realize it. If you value this tool and other work that I do on this channel, please consider joining my Patreon. I can't keep doing this if I can't pay the bills, and Patreon is the #1 way that I pay my bills. The minimum amount to join Patreon is $2 a month. Am I worth $2 to you? $2? No, I'm not. If you say so, I will keep making the content and I will keep trying to earn it. But if I'm worth at least $2 or maybe more a month, go down to the link in the video description below, click and join my Patreon. I hope that today's the day. So let's raise the P gain until we just find the point where it no longer goes unstable. And if I really raise it up, it reads unstable, but you can see that even if we take it down here where it doesn't technically read unstable, you can see that the oscillations are getting bigger. Let's just keep lowering that until we definitely see that the oscillations are staying the same size and or getting smaller. And we also see this red dot. come here to the first peak. That seems to indicate, okay, we're good. And then how can we make this better? And the way that we make it better is we add the D term. D term, a lot of times people will call it damping, although it's a little bit, that's a fair thing to call it, but also it can lead to some misunderstandings about how it actually works. I can tell you what the D term does mathematically, but it kind of won't make sense unless you're like, you got some calculus background. But the D term is calculated based on the derivative of the follower's velocity. What that means is that the faster the follower is going, the more the D term will try to slow it down. The D term opposes the velocity of the follower. When the follower is moving slowly, the D term doesn't do very much, and the P term dominates. When the P term causes the follower to be racing out of control, the D term opposes that and fights and slows it down. In order to demonstrate that, let's just take the I and D and feed forward to 0. We're going to induce some movement, and that oscillation will begin, and then we're going to add just a small amount of D, and what we'll see is that it will slow down. It's kind of like the drag function. It's kind of like drag, except drag is sort of a constant friction that's applying all the time, whereas the D term it applies more the faster the follower is going and less the slower the follower is going. So how do we find the optimal values for P and D? Because you can see that like there's a lot of different ways we can solve this problem. We like, okay, that's okay, we got a little bit of bouncing and oscillation here. If I bring P way up, that oscillation comes back, but then if I add D, that oscillation goes away. Like, how do we do this correctly? And in order to answer that question, let's go back to the step response graph and ask ourselves what we're really looking for out of a step response graph. And what we're looking for is for the step response to hit the target, that's this horizontal line here, as quickly as possible. So we want to see this rise time be as short as possible. Rise time is never going to be 0 because I moved the handle. The follower will always be just a little bit behind. It's going to have some reaction time because real world phenomena, like the drone is going to take some time to accelerate. It can't just follow an infinitely fast moving target. So the rise time is always going to be some value more than 0, but we want that rise time to be as short as possible so that the drone is tracking the movement of the set point as closely as possible. So then, okay, fine. Let's just raise this P. We can see that as I raise P, that rise time gets shorter and shorter, right? But the other thing we have then is we have a massive overshoot here. Let me just turn D down a little bit and amplify that overshoot. We have this massive overshoot. So we have a really short rise time, but we have a massive overshoot. And what's going to happen then is as I move, you see, oh gosh, I get this oscillation. Look at this model over here on the right. That's a model of an actual drone that's rotating. That's what a drone's PID controller does, is it manages the rotation. And you can see here with this PID tune, with this massively high P and just a little bit of D, we do get a very quick rise time, but then we get so much overshoot and oscillation, that's not good. That's not really what we want. So we add some D. Fine, we'll add some D. And if you look at the step response, you see D will calm down those oscillations, right? And then, okay, so I'll add a little more P, and that'll get my rise time lower, and add some more oscillations, and then we'll add some D, and that'll get my oscillations down. And you might think, okay, fine, I'm going to raise P and D to these insane values. Look, if I continue to raise D, I can actually completely get rid of that overshoot, right? And this is in some ways like a perfect step response graph. We rise perfectly to the commanded, whatever the set point is, with no overshoot, and boom, we just track it. Boom. That's beautiful. That's really good. But there's a reason we can't do this in the real world. There is a real world constraint on how high we can make our D gains, and that is noise. And by noise, I don't mean audible noise that you hear in your ears. I mean vibration. In the real world, the thing that we're measuring is the gyro sensor on the quadcopter. And in the real world, there is physical vibration and electrical noise that corrupts the data from the gyro sensor. In this app, we simulate that using the noise slider, and the noise slider injects a small amount of just random noise into the follower. So if I turn that noise slider all the way up, and actually if you maximize, you can see here, you can actually see the noise in the oscilloscope trace. So it's normally just a relatively low value of noise, not very much. And the reason that the noise acts as a limit on how high we can raise the D gain is that the D term, again we go back to the mathematics, the D term is a high pass filter. The D term amplifies high frequency noise. And the effect of that in the real world is that your motors get super hot and or smoke. And I have represented that here in the app with this motor heat readout. So when there is too much noise and or too much D gain, you get hot motors. And it's completely arbitrary, the scaling and so forth. Like I've tried to make it semi-realistic so that you can get a reasonable step response with a reasonable D gain and P gain without the motors smoking. But mostly it's to train you that when you have hot motors, there are two things you need to do. One of them is reduce the D gain in the system. So as I raise the D gain super high, the motors are burning hot. I land my aircraft and the motors are super hot. One of the things I can do is I can reduce the D gain and it'll bring that down. The other real world thing you can take from this is that when you have a lot of noise in your system, you will get hot motors at much lower D gains, and you will have a limitation on how high you can raise the D gain without getting excessively hot motors. So you can see here that if I crank the noise slider all the way up as I raise the D gain, I'm getting hot motors. I need to back that off. And my step response looks pretty crappy. I've got a lot of oscillation here. So, I need to bring my P gain down. Okay, now my step response kind of looks okay, but geez, look at my rise time. My rise time is 1400 milliseconds. It's much longer. As I raise the P term to try to get a better rise time, okay, that's better, I guess, but I would sure love to be able to raise my D gain. No, I can't. I get hot motors. This is why in the real world, we want our noise to be as low as possible. What that means is that we want a mechanically sound quadcopter. One of the sources of noise is vibrations. We don't want loose screws, we don't want cracked carbon fiber, and we want a sound frame design that doesn't have resonance. And one of the things we do when we go into Blackbox and actually start real world PID tuning is we look at the gyro readout and we see if there is noise, if there's harmonic resonance or anything like that. We want the noise to be as low as possible. We also want to reduce the electrical noise, which we do by having a capacitor. Theoretically, you could have a flight controller with a poorly designed gyro circuit, which is injecting noise into the gyro. You would have to change flight controllers in order to fix that. But we want a mechanically sound quadcopter, tight screws, good frame, strong carbon, no cracks, nothing like that. And we want a capacitor filtering the electrical system. And that is going to bring our real world noise slider down as low as possible and give us more flexibility to push the D gain and therefore more flexibility to push the P gain. So what we're looking for is a P gain high enough to bring the rise time as low as possible and a D gain that reduces that overshoot and ringing. But if we raise the D gain too high, there is another bad effect. Forget about, let's just take the noise all the way to the lowest. Forget about the noise or the motor heat for a minute. If we raise the D gain too high, we also see that as it gets higher, because it's slowing down the follower, it's also increasing our rise time. So here we've completely eliminated the overshoot. And because we have very little noise, we aren't getting hot motors, but we can see that this is actually like objectively a worse step response because our rise time is so long, whereas as we bring the D gain down, our rise time gets lower. This is better. We have a really nice rise time, 437 milliseconds with no overshoot whatsoever. And in my experience in the real world, I often look for a step response that looks more like this, with a little bit of overshoot and a much lower rise time. I think a lower rise time is more important than getting rid of every last little bit of overshoot. So maybe I would even accept, look at that, that's pretty good. Like we have a rise time of 271 milliseconds. We've got a fair amount of overshoot, but look at what that looks like if I move the follower. Like there's just a little bit of overshoot and then boom, it's pretty much locked in, right? There was more overshoot because we made more of a radical snap move. So I don't know, maybe we would have to in the real world, we're talking about like milliseconds of overshoot, right? So it might not even be noticeable, and it's going to have a quadcopter that feels really nice and sharp, but you can tune it. You can see as I bring that D up, the overshoot goes away, the rise time, oh, yeah. Oh, that's really good. Very little overshoot. Boom. It's really nice. Maybe that's what I like. But we can look at that step response and we can fly the actual drone and we can see what it's doing. Let's bring the motor heat back up and see. So here we've got slightly warm motors. We've got a really nice step response. Everything is good. Before we get on to the iTerm and the feed forward, let's take a look at the scope traces and try to just practice reading and interpreting them. Because we can watch the follower move and we can look at the step response graph, but sometimes we need to actually look at real world black box traces and see what a real PID controller and a real drone is doing. So here we've got one of those moves that I made. And again, the orange line is the set point. In a real drone, the set point is controlled by the stick position. In Betaflight, that's going to be a trace called RC command, and it's going to be the stick position left or right, forward or back, depending on which axis you're moving it on. So what we can see here is that we had the stick held slightly to the left. This center line here is center stick, and then here, when we're above the line where the stick is pushed slightly to the right. So we were pushed slightly to the left, we moved the stick to the right, and then we held the stick pointing to the right for a little while, and then we moved the stick back to the left, and we held the stick back to the left. The blue line, the follower, in a real black box trace is going to be the gyro. That's the gyro readout, which is reading out the actual quadcopter's rotation. And we can see that it more or less follows what we saw in the step response graph. We've got a little bit of overshoot, and then it settles back down onto the line. But in the real world, you will, well, first of all, in the real world, there's just a lot more variability because it's a real system and not a simulation. And second of all, in the real world, you don't have a calculated, predicted, perfect step response graph. You have to look at the actual behavior of the system and analyze what the step response is doing. That's why Brian White's PIDToolbox tool is so, it gives you that step response. But we can still look here and we can see that we have a little bit of overshoot and then it gets online. Now I could look at this and I could evaluate my rise time, and the rise time is roughly going to be the difference here, right? That's my rough rise time. All right, and I could even go into black box and I could evaluate how long that is. But you know, I could look at this and I can see I don't see a lot of oscillation or ringing. I don't see a massive amount of overshoot, and I could say, well, this looks pretty good. We can also evaluate the specific behavior of the individual PID terms. So this dark blue line here is the P term. This green line here is the D term, and for now, that's all we're going to worry about. We can see that as the error rises. So wait, we can turn error on. Here's error. The red line is error. We can see that as I move the set point, the orange line, the set point diverges from the gyro or the follower, the blue line. And because they have diverged, error grows. The P term, it gets huge. The P term rises proportional to the error. And so as the error grows, the P term grows. As that happens, the follower starts to move, and as the follower starts to move, the D term starts pushing in opposition to the follower's movement. So here we can see that the follower is moving upwards, and because it's moving upwards, the D term pushes against it downwards. Okay, the magnitude of these lines is a little bit off. Maybe I can fix that in a future iteration, because we can see that the P term is huge and the D term is huge, and the follower appears to be barely moving. So like the magnitude of them, don't read too much into it. We can see that as the follower moves, it approaches the set point, and therefore error decreases until error is at 0 at the point where the follower or the gyro matches the set point. And as that happens, the P term comes down. And then we can see that the D term, as the follower slows down, the D term gets slower and slower. And we can watch this happen sort of in real time. Well, in pause time. And now it's time to talk about the iTerm. And in a perfect world, the iTerm wouldn't even be needed. But you can see that the P term and the D term together can give us a very, very good step response with very good tracking, not too much overshoot. It's just really, it's sufficient. The iTerm is specifically there to deal with something called constant offset. And an example of constant offset in a drone would be if the drone's center of gravity was off balance, which it almost always is. And so the drone takes off and it's hovering, but because the center of gravity is forward, it wants to tip forward. And we simulate that here in the app with the CG slider. So if I move this CG slider, it will basically induce a constant pull to one side or the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the iTerm to 0. I'm going to take feed forward to 0. We're just going to have our P and our D, and we're going to pull the CG slider all the way down. And what you'll see if we look at the traces is that the P and the D term are trying to get that follower back onto the handle, but they can't do it. And the effect is that the follower, it doesn't just keep falling to the left forever. Like if we didn't have any P or D, the follower would just fall off the left side. We just have this constant left offset and it would just fall to the edge. But if we have a working P and D controller and we add a constant offset, it balances out at some point, but it's not on center. No matter what I do, it's always going to be slightly to the left of center because of that constant offset. The way that iTerm works is it's not responding to what's happening right now. If there is error in this moment of time, the P term and the D term will fix it. But as error continues to accumulate over time, the iTerm grows and grows and grows and grows until eventually it becomes sufficient to solve the problem. So let's resume the simulation and let's add a little bit of I. And as we do, we will see that this should get back to center. Now I'm going to add a ton of I, and it resolves itself. So one way to think about P, I, and D is that the P term is looking at the present. Is there error right now? The D term is actually looking at the future. I am going to try and keep you from overshooting by fixing the future overshoot that hasn't happened yet. And the I term is looking at the past. In the past, you failed to correct an error, and I'm going to try and like scoop up that stuff that sort of fell on the floor, and I'm going to try and clean it up and get rid of it. Now, we actually saw a phenomena called iTerm Windup when I added that iTerm. Let's talk about iTerm Windup. So I'm going to bring I to 0, and I'm going to move the follower. And, oh yeah, I have to offset the CG. And I'm going to offset the CG. And we're going to just let this sit for a while. There's been error for a long time. What you're going to see is that when I add iTerm in, it's going to overshoot the other direction. And then it's going to slowly come back. So iTerm windup happens when there has been error for a long time, and the iTerm finally gets a chance to clean it up. And this is happening in the 5 to 10 second sort of time scale here in the example, but in drones it happens in the sub-second time scale. A common place for iTerm windup to happen is if you do a full roll, a 360 roll. The quadcopter accelerates very rapidly, and there is some error that's built up over the course of the roll because it can't accelerate as quickly maybe as it wants to. The roll happens, and at the end of the roll, when you stop the roll, a whole bunch of error and iTerm has wound up during the roll, and at the end of the roll, the iTerm is like, no, 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 and you get a little bit of bounce back. iTerm windup can look very much like P-term overshoot and oscillation. They do look similar. The difference is that iTerm windup and overshoot is a slow bounce back, whereas P-term is a more sharp and shorter bounce back. With practice, you can learn to recognize them. However, iTerm windup has more or less been fixed in Betaflight and modern flight control firmware. Basically, when the drone is moving rapidly, the iTerm is suppressed so that you don't get a windup of error, and it's only when the drone is moving slowly that iTerm is allowed to sort of do its job. The last term we need to talk about is feed forward. The difference between the feed forward term and all of the other terms is that all of the other terms are responding to the actual movement and the actual error of the quadcopter. We're looking at the gyro. The gyro is telling us how the quadcopter is moving, and we're saying that is too slow, that is too fast. It was too slow, it will be too slow, but we're looking at the actual movement of the quadcopter. But the idea here is that we know that the follower will always be behind the set point. There will always be a delay from the moment that you move the stick on the controller to the moment that the quadcopter starts moving. And so rather than wait for the error to accumulate, we're going to start moving the quadcopter the minute the stick moves. We're going to start pushing it. We know if I move the stick to roll right, the quadcopter has to roll right. We don't want to wait for the error to rise, and then the P term to arise, and then the quadcopter to start moving. We're just going to start pushing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put P, I, and D at 0. And by the way, feed forward is not accounted for in the step response graph. In the real world, it is because you're measuring the actual movement of the drone. But in the simulator, the feed forward can't be simulated because it depends on how fast and how far I move the handle. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to move the handle, and we can see that when I do that, the follower gets a push that direction. And then what does it do? It just keeps going. Well, we can understand that if we look at the graph. Here, I move the set point. As the set point is moving, feed forward pushes. And then when the set point stops moving, there is no more feed forward. Feed forward responds only to the input. It doesn't respond to anything but the input. I pushed the stick left, the follower got pushed left, the stick isn't moving, that's it. Feed forward can't work all by itself. It has to have the P, the I, and the D. It supplements the P, the I, and the D. And so what we see is that the follower just keeps moving until eventually it runs out of, I don't know, it's just off the chart now. If I move this way, it pushes it left. Do you see that feed forward is only responding to the movement of the set point? It doesn't care about the position of the set point. If I move the set point right, it pushes the follower to the right. If I move the set point to the left, it pushes the follower to the left. So the goal with feed forward is that feed forward gives a little boost to the follower at the moment that you give the input. The next place to go from here is to start PID tuning with Blackbox and or PIDToolbox. And I'm going to link you not to one of my own videos, but I'm going to link you to Brian White's channel about tuning with PIDToolbox and Chris Rosser's PID tuning video, which is another way of talking about PID tuning, but the difference is that Chris Rosser actually gives you a procedure you can follow with a real drone, as opposed to just kind of like a conceptual understanding that I'm shooting for here. I'm going to put cards on screen and links in the video description below to those videos. I hope you find this tool useful. I had a great time making it, and I will see you in the next one.